So here we are in York, and we've got here Linda, Bellos, and Sheila Jeffreys. Say hi to the camera. Look, you have to lean back a bit. We'll sort it out a bit better. Okay. Sheila.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Some of you may not know who I am. I'm a retired professor. I was a professor at the University of Melbourne, but before I went there, up till 1991, I was a lesbian feminist here in the UK. And the most recent book is called Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism. It's very nice for me to be able to be here to talk to you because, as some of you will be certainly knowing tonight, if you didn't know it before, that it's very difficult to speak about this issue because transgender activists make it very, very difficult to have any kind of feminist analysis of transgenderism. You are simply not allowed to say it. There were attempts to get my book banned, to make sure the publisher didn't publish it, and so on and so on. And I got called a fascist, and like David Irving, the Holocaust denier, and so on and so on. It's been very difficult for me to speak, so it's very nice that you have come here to hear me and that I'm able to address you tonight. I mean, that's really lovely. So what I'm going to do is do a bit of history and discussion of the construction, the invention of this thing called transgenderism. Because I was in another life a historian. I have most recently for decades been a political scientist. So that's my take on things. I'm sort of looking at the construction of transgenderism historically and politically. Because that will help us understand the problems with the projected gender identity bill. Now, when the Women and Equalities Committee was set up a couple of years ago of the government, previous government, I guess, but present government, the first thing that was examined was the rights of persons who are transgender, which was kind of surprising because we had thought it might be about women, but in fact it was mainly about men. That was the very, very first thing to be addressed. And in fact, feminists were not asked. We didn't get a chance to put any of their concerns. And that committee recommended that there should be improvements to and changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which was the previous legislation of 2004, changes that the transgender activist movement wanted. Now, the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 set up a panel that persons who wanted to transgender, it was overwhelmingly men at the time, as historically it has always been, they could come before this panel, and if they had statements from two doctors, they could actually get recognized by the panel as having a different gender from, well, since gender doesn't exist, it's not the gender they originally had because it's all invented. I've always thought it was rather interesting you could have a gender recognition panel. This is the state taking on the task of recognizing the stereotyped characteristics expected of two classes in a hierarchy in society. Now, the state is going to tell you whether you're doing masculinity, the behavior of the oppressors, well enough, or femininity, the behavior of the oppressed, well enough. Now, why is that the duty of the state? And why is the state involved? It's a kind of extraordinary political situation. And I always wondered whether, if I came up before the panel, what I'd be recognized as. I mean, I don't know whether anybody in this room feels that they've properly got masculinity or properly got femininity. I haven't got either.
I've got more masculinity than most people.
No, you don't have more. As far as I know, you're just perfectly ordinary woman and lesbian. So, yes, absolutely. As I am myself. So, I haven't got gender. I don't want gender. I have no desire for gender. Why is the state involved in recognizing and enforcing the correct characteristics of two classes of persons in a relationship of power, that is men and women, in the way that they are? So the Recognition Act of 2004 was extraordinary in itself. It is even more extraordinary that that was not sufficient for transgender activists. They went on to say that there should be the legislation which is likely to come into Parliament before the end of the year now, which is the Gender Identity Bill. And the Gender Identity Bill will enable, mostly men again, to say that actually they are women, sign a piece of paper saying that they are, and enter all women's spaces as women, toilets, prisons, sports teams, etc., etc., etc. If this legislation is introduced at in the state of politics at the present, the government and the opposition both support this idea that men should be able to say they are simply women, sign a piece of paper, and become so. I think, well, where are we? In some kind of extraordinary science fiction. But actually, that is the situation that we're in. Now, with the 2004 Act, the medical practitioners had to say that these men who came before the committee had something called gender dysphoria, some kind of medical condition. The Gender Identity Bill doesn't require that. Any man can just come and sign his name. Now, the situation is that we are, I want to say, in a crisis around transgenderism at the moment. For many years, the mainstream media, politicians, policymakers have promoted the idea that children. In fact, of course, men cannot become women. And I suspect the majority of people know this. But it's become not just impolite, but potentially dangerous to say this. In The Guardian on Saturday, for instance, there was something called A Letter to My Children to Tell Them That I Am Transgender. It was by a man who says he doesn't yet dare to tell his children that he's about to become a woman. Saying, the only time I have to pretend I'm a man these are the days and weekends when you come to visit. His wife has left him. And he bemoans the fact that he's too scared to tell his children that he's going to be doing this thing, becoming a woman. The expected response from the leaders is, of course, sympathy, not for the wife and children, for whom he is about to create huge misery or has already created huge misery, but for the man who is pursuing his fantasy of becoming a woman. So it's an extraordinary thing that serious newspapers are carrying reports of this kind and promoting the idea that a man can become a woman in this way. Now, one result of the positive portrayal of the practice is that referrals of children to gender identity clinics have hugely increased. This is just one symptom of what is going on as transgenderism is promoted and accepted. Whilst the idea and practice of transgendering children was unheard of a couple of decades ago, the idea that there could be such a creature as a transgender child has become a social contagion. And it's creating a human rights violation on a massive scale. In 2016, there were 2,016 referrals of children of 3 to 18 to gender identity clinics, and that was more than 6 times the number 5 years previously. So this is in the UK. The numbers are going up hugely. This year, the number referred has gone up to 50 a week, which is a rise by 2,500% since 2009. And we expected to believe that this is some kind of real discovery of real transgender children, rather than obviously something fashionable and socially created. It's just one aspect of the huge rise in the acceptance and practice of transgenderism in recent years. Now, transgendering of children is promoted by adult men who transgender, because, as they themselves admit, they want their practice of transgenderism to lose the sexual stigma that's attached to it, because it comes from cross-dressing. It's just an expression of cross-dressing behavior, transvestism, which is a paraphilia, it's a sexual fetish. They want it to lose that sexual stigma, and they think if they can actually say that children are really transgender and should be transgender, the sexual stigma will go, because if children have got it, it's essential, it's something real. So adult men have engineered the transgender of children in order to remove the sexual stigma from their practice. An example of the promotion of the practice to children is the fact that there's an exhibition which has just opened at the Brighton Museum called Transology, which has talks for 13 to 14-year-olds and includes a pair of preserved breasts in a jar to show what young women can achieve. It's like science fiction, isn't it? And you try to imagine that maybe it is, but it's not. Now, the ideology of transgenderism is that persons who transgender are essentially endowed with something called gender, which consists of the mental and behavioural characteristics more suited to someone of the opposite sex. Now, of course, transgender ideology lies about gender, and it says it's the same as sex. And in fact, though, of course, sex is biological, cannot be changed. What men who transgender change is their clothing, hair, makeup, sometimes the way they speak and sit. There are all these videos online teaching men how to speak, how to sit, how to flick their hair. There's a lot of hair flicking, which is about a really feminine thing to do. I don't have enough, and I don't think I've ever done it. Because I'm not, I guess, authentic. They're not precisely the stereotype forms of appearance and behaviour that feminists have fought for decades to abolish. Their wives complain that they seek to look like Barbie dolls and bedeck themselves in ways that the women in their lives consider to be degrading. The creation of such caricatures is the result of the fact that the men get their idea of womanhood from the pornography that they consume, and I will go on to talk a bit more about that pornography in a moment. Transgender ideology states that the men who transgender have mysteriously acquired women's brains in biologically male bodies and that they possess a feminine essence. Men who transgender do not like critical analysis of where transgenderism comes from because this undermines the essentialness of their condition. The legislative and policy gains they have made, which endanger women's rights and threaten to disappear women as biologically female persons, are based upon this ideology. And to support it, the idea that there is an essence, they argue there have always been transgenders in history. They emphatically reject the argument that I'm going to put to you now, that transgenderism was invented and constructed in the latter half of the 20th century. Now, there's no sociological or political analysis in the newspapers, in the media, as to why the phenomenon of transgenderism has arisen, or why it's burgeoning so much or so quickly. Everybody is supposed to believe its essence, so you cannot actually look at where did it come from. In fact, of course, it is socially and politically constructed, and the present contagion is the result of forces of power in a heteropatriarchal society rather than about any innate or transhistorical condition. Transgender activists may state, for instance, that there have always been transgender children and these children were suffering in silence. There, of course, have not always been transgender children. Indeed, back in the 1970s, we tried to get rid of gender stereotyping of children. I can remember working to do that even as early as 1971. We didn't think that little girls should be forbidden from playing with train engines and so on, because we didn't believe in gender stereotypes. There certainly haven't been transgender children in history unless you actually believe that little girls should not play with trains and little boys should not wear robins on their underwear. That's being used now to diagnose transgender children. An 18-month-old boy might want robins on his knickers, therefore he must really be a girl. And yes, really, if you read my book, there is this. These are the sort of things that are being said. Now, as transgenderism grows as a social contagion, the many social harms associated with it increase exponentially. And they include, of course, conflict with women's rights. They include the conversion of young lesbians and gay men to surgically constructive heterosexuality, because transgenderism is conversion therapy away from homosexuality to heterosexuality. It includes serious health problems created by treatment and many other problems which we may not have time enough to deal with this evening. I will only be dealing in this particular talk with men because it was men who invented the practice that have mainly forged the campaign for transgender rights and so on. I'm very happy to talk about the transgendering of lesbians and young girls and young women, which are for very, very different reasons. And I'm happy to do that in a question time. I'm going to concentrate on men right now. Okay. Now, the concept of transgenderism was, the US anthropologist David Valentine says, institutionalized in the 1990s. So we can trace it back to the 1990s. He was an AIDS safe-sex educator in New York City, and he was sent by the charity that he works for to what was seen as the stroll, in which gay men working in prostitution would be found, where he could do same-sex education. And he was told these were transgenders. Right? So he went to these places and discovered that none of the men there thought that they were transgender. They knew they were men, they knew they were gay men, they were perfectly happy having their penises, they didn't think there was anything transgender about them, because at that time the concept hadn't reached them. It hadn't been enforced by forces of power coming out through these NGOs and institutions and now universities to actually make these perfectly ordinary men, gay men, transgendered, get them to accept themselves as somehow transgendered. They didn't know about the category, so of course they were not transgender at that time. Now he says that he does say that we need to look at the forces of power that constructed that situation, that these gay men didn't know they were transgender. The charity is sending him out there to deal with transgenders in the 1990s. We're in the political sort of historical situation where the phenomenon is being constructed. Now, the terms transsexual, transgender. The term transsexual, which preceded transgender, was coined in the 1950s to describe persons who wished to change their sex as it was seen then. And it was popularized by the endocrinologist Harry Benjamin in his book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, because transsexualism and transgenderism are mainly created by the medical profession. At that time, there was generally a distinction made between cross-dressers or transvestites, which was recognized, as I say, as a sexual fetish, a paraphilia, and many men did this on the weekend, or so, in a evening during the week, or just in their room, or got their wives to walk down the street with them while they in their clothes, or whatever. A distinction was made at that time between cross-dressers and men who actually impersonated the opposite sex and wanted social recognition of themselves as women. These were seen as two different categories. The term transgender itself was actually coined by a heterosexual crossdresser, a man who called himself Virginia Prince. And he sought to distinguish himself from transsexuals and thought that men wanting to cut their penises off was sadly mistaken. He was totally against that idea. And of course, it is counterproductive because the sexual excitements that come from cross-dressing are less easily approached if the penis is removed. So there's some contradiction involved there. Virginia Prince started a magazine in the US for cross-dressers called Transvestia, and he worked to create a more acceptable face for cross-dressing, and in fact to remove the sort of sexual element from it so that it was not seen as sexual. Now, his adoption of the term transgender was part of what we might call the move to gender, from being seen as transsexual to being seen as transgender. It's a move to gender that takes place, in which both cross-dressing and transsexualism came to be understood as expressions of an internal or essential gender, rather than simply being hobbies carried out for sexual excitement. The term transgender was normalized through the queer politics of the 1990s, when it was adopted to convey a wide meaning encompassing all of those who were seen as engaging in behavior most usually allotted to the opposite sex, from butch lesbians to cross-dressing, gay, men, and so on. Presently, the term transgender is used in common parlance to refer to those who would once have called themselves transsexual, a word which is no longer really used. The language has changed. The distinction has completely broken down between cross-dressing and transgenderism. And the term is being so widely used now that it can mean, as the new legislation would have it, just a man who decides on a particular day to sign a piece of paper, or a man who just dresses up in high-heel shoes on Sundays, and so on. It no longer refers to a medical condition, certainly doesn't require surgery. The vast majority of men who say they are women still have all their male organs. Now, transgenderism historically, where does it come from historically? It is a recent invention. Transgender activists do indeed say that there have always been persons who were transgender. But the reasons some persons cross-dressed in history are very, very different from what's happening now. There were women who cross-dressed in history, and they cross-dressed because they could not earn decent money as women. They often joined the army. They would like to become plumbers. Even in the 20th century, there were women who, in order to become plumbers, would have to cross-dress as men. So they cross-dressed in order to live with women and in order to actually support themselves and those women and have decent jobs and so on. It didn't mean that they thought they were men, they never thought they were men, that did not occur to them. They did this for a jobs worth situation. Men who cross-dressed historically did so for sexual excitements, and they didn't either say that they were women. So this idea that people who cross-dress actually say they are actually members of the opposite sex is a kind of extraordinary development at the end of the 20th century, which is actually a very scientific century. And you'd think that that would mean that this idea would not take off, but extraordinarily it has. So transgenderism at the end of the 20th century required the support of medicine. It was medical men who constructed transgenderism. Now, particularly sexologists, the science of sex, as religion fell out of favour in the late 19th century, the scientists of sex came in to talk about how sexual practices were constructed, and they said that homosexuality was created by something going wrong in the body that actually meant that, probably in the fetus or in the womb, that somehow homosexual men were more feminine and so on. They said that the thing about men who were homosexual is that they liked the colour green and they were unable to whistle. Whereas, and this was natural and innate and to do with, they didn't know the word genes, but somehow innate. The problem with lesbians is that they could whistle and liked the colour purple.
That is true.
You
can whistle.
Actually, I can't whistle very well.
I'm very good at whistling.
Shall we have a whistle? Shall we have a whistle?
Sex is whistling.
So, I mean, it may be true, because there are lesbians in the room and they can whistle.
What's the relationship between one and the other?
I don't know. These chaps said it. Now, by the 1920s and early 1930s, the sexologists, the scientists of sex, were starting to conduct experiments in which they actually put, for instance, goats' testes into men to increase their virility, and started to try and engage in sort of physical cross-sex surgery. And a very well-known victim of this was the man who was in the film The Danish Girl, who died as a result of an attempt to put a womb into him. So these surgeries were very serious and very vicious, as these sexologists played about with the possibility of transsexing people at that time. It really got going, the idea that people could be physically transsexed, in the 1950s. And at that time, it was mostly homosexual men that the sexologists were seeking to transsex. The transsexing of cross-dressers, ordinary heterosexual cross-dressers, tended to come rather later. Now, Bernice Hausmann, who is a historian of transgenderism, says that it was the public dissemination of scientific knowledge of the human endocrine system that enabled certain human subjects to understand themselves as members of the other sex. So the sexologists, the doctors, are now understood about hormones. They realized that you could actually put hormones into bodies and change sex. And as they started to promote those findings and understandings, then certain persons in the population were able to think, I could be in that category and have a different understanding of themselves. And so we got mainly men at that time starting to come forward saying that they would like to change sex. So the creation of the possibility and the category by the medical profession creates what Bernice Hausmann calls the demanders, those persons who then come forward and say that they do want this to be done to themselves by these doctors. She says that the crucial thing was endocrinology. That provided medicine with the tools to enforce sexual dimorphism, not just to examine and describe it. So endocrinology, working out how the endocrine system worked, was crucial to the idea that you could actually start to transgender or transsex people. there were 3 medical developments that were necessary. Plastic surgery was one. A development, of course, hugely increased after the First World War and then again after the Second World War in order to deal with persons who'd had serious injuries in war. But that could then be used to start to do the creation of the genitalia supposedly that fitted the sex or gender of persons who sought to cross to transsex. Also, good forms of anesthesia were necessary in order to carry out those brutal and vicious surgeries. So all of those medical specialisms were necessary because before the idea that somebody could actually be transsexed or later transgendered could actually develop. In fact, the historian Vern Bullock, who he's a historian of sexuality, he said in 1973 that transsexualism might be iatrogenic. Now, iatrogenic means a health problem created by medicine itself. In other words, it might exist, he says, simply because surgeons could now do sex changes which weren't possible before. So the medical profession created this phenomenon. And even in those early years, the idea that transsexualism was a condition which required treatment by hormones and surgery was not well accepted. The doctors really argued amongst themselves at the time. The first famous transsexual in the US who was created was a man called Christine Jorgensen. And there was a turf war which broke out around what was the correct treatment for this man. Christine Jorgensen was a homosexual man. And the doctors told him that he was indeed a woman and could be created into a woman, and set out to perform these terrible mutilations upon him. The male demanders of transgender treatment, as I think I've probably already explained by now, fall into these 2 categories. Homosexual men who feel unable to love women whilst remaining in a male body, and that is all still going on, particularly amongst young homosexual men. Teenagers and men in their young 20s. And men who were overwhelmingly heterosexual and transgenders as a climax to their interest in cross-dressing, which is often something they've been doing for about 11 years old when they start wearing their sisters' or their mother's clothing in front of the mirror and get sexually excited. Jorgensen was persuaded by his doctors, he was a woman, but homosexual men are a minority of those who are transgendering now. It is mostly 60 or more % of those who are transgendering, the men now, seem to be heterosexual cross-dressers rather than homosexual men. The cross-dressers, you will know some of them quite well. There's Bruce Jenner, he's a cross-dresser. There's a man called Frank Maloney, who was a boxing entrepreneur, 63 years old. These men tend to have lots of children and several wives. They tend to do this as something that excitement for their old age, I think, really, because they are perfectly ordinary men for most of their lives, except they've probably always been cross-dressing from quite a young age, and they probably have been fairly secretive about that. Now, another force in the construction of transgenderism was the movement of cross-dressers in the 1960s and 70s. Cross-dressers groups were formed all over the United States and in the UK. In the UK, the group was called the Beaumont Society. It still exists. And at its inception, it would not allow transsexuals to enter, only cross-dressers, interestingly enough. But now it covers both categories. And this is a symptom of the fact that transsexuals were going a bit far and besmirching the name of cross-dressers. But now it covers both categories. What's happening today is that more and more cross-dressing men are claiming that they're really women. So this has been the sort of huge increase in the amount of transgenderism that's going on. Now, this early movement in the 60s and 70s, the cross-dressers movement, didn't have access to the internet. It had magazines and subscription lists and so on. The internet provided a big boost to the development of a movement of transgenderism. The adoption of the term gender and the idea of gender and the idea of gender mistakes and a feminine essence in these men and so on, was adopted, as I've explained, so that these men could try and get rid of being besmirched by their sexual motivation. Because sexual motivations mean it would be hard to get health insurance, for instance. It's not as socially acceptable to be somebody who practices a paraphilia. It's much more acceptable to say that you have somehow mysteriously, from the stalk, acquired an essence of femininity that's dropped into your brain at 63 years old, after you've had many, many children, wives, and a career in boxing, and so on. Often the men, in fact, most often the men who do transgender have been in very, very masculine occupations, in the military and so on. Sportsmen like Jenna. So they've been very, very masculine, and then they sort of relax into their feminine essence in their 60s or 70s. Now, unfortunately for them, these men have been unable to entirely get rid of the scent of the sexual perversion around their behaviour, particularly because women like me go out and give lots of information, as I'm going to give to you now, to make it very clear that for the majority of men, heterosexual cross-dressers, it is actually a sexual problem. An increasing number of sexologists, psychiatrists are coming out about the fact that they do think there's sexual behaviour on the part of men, and stating so very, very clearly. They get a great deal of harassment in the same way that feminists who want to talk about the politics of transgenderism also get harassment. For instance, Bailey, who's a sexologist who's received a great deal of harassment, including having photographs of his children put online with various sexualized messages. They can be very, very vicious, and will continue to be very, very vicious, these men who translate. He and another writer say, in a piece they wrote together, that a common aspect of what they and some of these other sexologists who say it's about sex call autogynephilia, loving the woman, or rather getting sexually aroused by the woman in yourself, autogynephilia. And Bailey and Trier say that a common aspect of autogynephilia is the erotic fantasy of being admired in the female persona by another person. So, Ray Blanchard, who's another sexologist, also says that a signal difference between autogynephiles and homosexuals, to whom they're often compared, is that homosexuals don't seek a reaction from passers-by for their sexual satisfaction. Yeah. Indeed not. Whereas the heterosexual men who progress from cross-dressing to transgenderism act as if they're in a perpetual movie into which other persons, such as wives, are inducted, however unwillingly, to play the part of audience. And so these men say they have to go into the women's toilets because they have to have the women look at them. In one case, a man was found constantly trying to get the women to shake his hands in the toilets, just to make sure that they recognised him as a woman in the women's toilets because of the sexual satisfaction.
We don't shake hands.
Yeah,
Or anyway.
Well,
It's not guilty.
they don't always remember how they should be behaving in order to keep the fantasy going. And he wanted the physical contact, obviously. So these men who want to go into the women's toilets and demand entry do not want separate toilets for transsexuals or transgenders. They want to be in the women's toilets. And what's happening in women's toilets in Britain now is they're disappearing in many places and they're becoming mixed toilets, which transgenders can enter and women. The men retain their toilets because these men who are wearing dresses do want to be in there. They want to be in with the women, recognised as women, able to shake the hand if necessary and have the sexual excitement of being there. Okay? That's absolutely crucial. Now, it's been unacceptable to say that this practice is sexual, and I think it still is. I think that people don't really like to talk about sex very much. They don't think about it. Women don't look at the pornography. They don't read about this, so they don't really know very much about what these men are into. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of. The sexologists explained that the sexual excitement attached to the practice is a form of masochism. And interestingly, Bailey and Trier say, of men who die practicing the dangerous masochistic activity of autoerotic asphyxia, as some men do, approximately 24% are cross-dressed at the time they do it. So yes, it's very definitely associated with masochism, often in very serious kinds. And I've argued elsewhere that the excitement of autogynephilia is masochistic from the pornography of cross-dressers. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. Now, there's plentiful evidence that autogynephilia is what's happening. There are, for instance, the narratives that the transgender psychologist Anne Lawrence, he's a man, he still calls himself Anne Lawrence. I suspect that he no longer thinks of himself as a woman if he ever did, because quite a few men who have transgender are now coming out and saying, actually, we're not women. We're really not. And they're trying to fight what's happening. And Anne Lawrence is one of those. He's collected 59 narratives from men who transgender, and he's done a book talking about what they are actually, why they actually do it, what the motivations are. And one narrative describes the author's sexual excitement at being taken for a woman. Remember, these men are going around in the changing rooms of women's stores, in the toilets, wanting to be taken for women. And this man says, in the early days, I would become aroused whenever anyone, a sales clerk, a casual stranger, would address me as ma'am, or perform some courtesy, such as holding a door for me. So the excitement is really, really clear. You can see why they want to be in these sorts of spaces. Another explains that both before and after sex reassignment surgery, he liked to pretend to menstruate. It was and still is sexually exciting. Surgery, I would pretend to menstruate by urinating in sanitary pads. I particularly enjoyed wearing the old-fashioned belted pad with long tabs. And the extraordinary thing is that in some months ago now, in 2016, I think, I was in a committee room at the House of Parliament where there was a report on what the Equality Committee had done on transgenderism. And we were all supposed to sit there and be entirely and straightforwardly serious about men who had the essence of women in them and all of these rights. I could not talk about the sanitary pads there. I might have wished to, but I was not in a position to. It is extraordinary, isn't it? It is extraordinary. Well, nobody will ever allow me out to speak again. The shape of the transgender pornography industry, I realize I'll bring this to a close fairly quickly, but I'll just tell you about the transgender pornography industry so you'll get a sense of what's going on out there. Transgender pornography is 10% of the porn industry. So it covers a great many men. There's huge numbers of men who use transgender pornography who will not go on to cross-dress. But the pornography is fascinating because it shows what it is they're actually after. It's a very, very fast-growing sector, and the industry itself says that the sector is growing because there's more and more acceptance of transgenderism. So it's building the transgender pornography industry. And transgender pornography has all the different shapes and sizes of the ordinary pornography industry. It has videos and so on and so on. I didn't want to look at that. And I didn't look at that, so I looked at the 100 best transgender erotica books on Amazon, which are in themselves completely fascinating, and you get a good idea of the psychology of what it is that creates the money shot in that kind of pornography. From just reading the descriptions in the books, you don't have to look at the video pornography, which I would not be able to bear to do. In the transgender pornography novels, there's three main categories. They're mainly about forced feminization. In the pornography, the men are forced to wear women's clothing, and the collapse in status is so exciting. That's the money shot, the moment of which they're forced to have makeup put on, or lipstick put on, or whatever. It's about the collapse in status. That is the masochism, because they are very aware. They're very politically aware. There was some advice online to men about how to sit. and it said that women have to sit with their knees together, so the men should make sure they put their knees together. If they take up space, it's about power. Women don't have power and keep their knees together, so men wanting to imitate women must keep their knees together. They're very politically astute. They understand the hierarchy of power between men and women. So I'll give you a few examples of this. There's The New Girl, a forced feminization novel by Holly Sharp. The writers are, I think, all men, but they have sort of slightly sex industry names. And the hero of the novel, he has high status as CEO of a major oil company, but he's about to lose his job. He applies for a new job as assistant to a CEO, which is advertised as stockings optional, ready to assume the position. Submit your resume today. Right? And it says about the video, about the book, it concerns male to female cross-dressing, male submission, forced feminization, as well as oral and anal sex between a man and a feminized male. And the cover photo shows a man in heels and a short skirt taking something from a filing cabinet. Does anybody do that anymore? They still do in this particular kind of male fantasy. They still do. In heels, and he's in a subordinate female servicing role. Now, forced feminization we used in the books to create the sexual excitement of being punished, and that's a theme of A Day at the Feminization Factory, two transgender transformation tales. And so on and so on and so on. Oh, there's also a science fiction element. These men take pills, and in some way, suddenly they are female. And there's this wonderful book called Gender Swapped in Space. Gender Swapped by Aliens, which is one of my very favorites. And it says that the man is taken aboard a spaceship and he's forcibly feminized. Now that Casey's body is bursting with fertile desire, she's everything the aliens need. Now, once the men have been feminized, they resemble porn models, they have breast implants, they have corsets, they show their bottoms, and so on. They don't get feminized into ordinary middle-aged women holding down jobs and offices, because that would not be sexy. Now, there are other categories in transgender erotica. There's categories called sissification, which is one category of forced feminization. Men are forced to be sissies. There's bimbofication. There's strumpetization, and so on. So these are all making men into subordinate categories of women for the sexual excitement that's involved. But there are other categories as well. There's pregnancy pornography. Men suddenly find themselves not just female, but pregnant, because that's particularly horrifying. There's lactation pornography. There's lots of lactation pornography, which tends to include things like Thai ladyboys have been trafficked and are fed with estrogen until they're actually producing milk, and so in the pornography the men are sucking the milk out of the breasts of the Thai ladyboys. And there's a transgender lactation rights movement which says that men should be able to breastfeed in public.
Don't spend hours with
people. Children, I suppose, yes. So they should be able to. They'll do a lot of estrogen, and then they'll want to breastfeed children. I don't know, their own or somebody else's in public. So there's lactation pornography, and then there's of course age regression when they go back to being female girls, such as He's Stuck as a Schoolgirl, a novel of transgender sugar and spice. So you can see that the pornography is quite sophisticated, but the message, what it's all about, is very clear. Now, there's a huge enthusiasm in the pornography for cutting women down to size, and it's men who are actually in those positions. There's bimbo transformation, novellas, anything for the job. The hero takes a drug called appropriately bimbasic. It's lovely. The science fiction stuff is fascinating, the names of the drugs and so on. And that turns him into a bimbo. And that novel is called A Gender-Bending Bimbo Transformation Story, which contains descriptions of masturbation, oral sex, and body alterations, including male to female transformations and breast enlargement. It also includes light BDSM themes. And when men are strumpetized, they take strumpetification serum. Strumpetification serum. It's quite hard to say, isn't it? But I think it's really important to look at these books, and if one could bear it, even to look at the other forms of the pornography, because I think there's a lot of ignorance. Do you not feel there's a lot of ignorance about what the motivation really is behind what's going on? Do you feel it makes it clearer, knowing about the pornography, having this kind of information? Okay, other forces constructing transgenderism in the late 19th century, of course, were queer politics and something called transgender feminism. Queer politics, the ideas of Judith Butler and so on, that gender could just be swapped and played with, and it was transgressive and progressive for men to wear skirts and so on. That was very influential, particularly in the universities. And of course, a lot of the material supporting transgenderism coming out of the universities now, and they now do transgender studies. There's transgender studies in which men who've become women supposedly teach young students about how men can become women in what used to be called women's studies programs, which are now called gender studies programs. So there are first-year courses in transgender studies. It's extraordinary, isn't it, that we have got to this situation. Now I shall rush through and simply explain that what's happened because of the internet is that many men's sexual fetish interests have become communities and networks on the net. The net has enabled this to happen. So you have communities and networks of men who are into corsets, and they boast to each other about how they wear tighter and tighter corsets. There's men into high-heeled shoes. There are, of course, men into child sex and child pornography. The internet has enabled the development of these communities, and it has enabled the development of the transgender community. It's been very, very influential in doing that. It's also enabled transableism. In transableism, the men want to have an accident that means they're confined to a wheelchair. They don't usually manage to find doctors who are prepared to break their backs. They do sometimes find doctors who are prepared to take legs off. A lot of them are wanting their legs off. You can find pornography sites. I found one gay male pornography site where men talked about fondling stumps. So there's sexual interest behind all of this. And that the idea of getting legs off is called body identity integrity disorder, and it's based on transgenderism. And very often the personnel are the same. There are men who are transgender who also want legs off, and so on. Now, the people online who are creating identities for themselves are quite often quite unusual. There are there's a woman who sees herself as a Korean cat. And so on. And so there are quite a lot of young people particularly want to be wolves. And actually some of them are having physical transformations, so they have things growing up. Okay, so what I'm going to just conclude for you is why have we got to this point? Well, we've got the state intending legislation to enable these sexual fetish behaviour on the part of men. I call it a sexual rights movement, a men's sexual rights movement. As men have they have pornography, they have prostitution. Huge parts of the world are constructed to serve men's fetishes, and we now have an attempt to create legislation which will enable these men with these particular kinds of fetishes to be out there involved in women's spaces. Thank you. That's it.
Well, how do I follow that? With difficulty, and I'm not going to try, except to address a different aspect of what Sheila said. I don't doubt for a moment any of the research and analysis that you have done. My focus tends to be the political use of power, and I have, perhaps it's naive, but I have a desire to see the notion of equality in the world. I say that as a black woman, I say that as a woman, and having grown up with a very conscious awareness that being female puts me in a lesser position than that of my brother, a male. And it's still played out 60-something years later. I was very, very struck. In fact, I got a note today from a trans woman whom I know. I can't remember what she said to me, but something. I said she, because I'm going to be respectful. That she's very hurt by what I've said. And I asked her a question about race, because it seems to me that one of the categories that human beings, and actually men, came up with the notion of races. The categorization of races seems to have been created around the time of gender being created. And I remain, it's very funny listening to some of the rubbish that's being said about what chaps do, because I must say that having born 2 children, I think I'm physiologically and in any other senses a female and actually a woman. But I play football and I box. And if any one of those bastards comes anywhere near me, I will take my glasses off and drop them. Anyway, yeah, I take my glasses off. I take my glasses off and I leave. I can't see a bleeding thing. That's not the point. It's not the point. But I do. I'm quite prepared to be to threaten violence because it seems to me that politically, what they're seeking to do is piss on all women. That's what they're doing for their personal gratification. There aren't many of them, but what really offends me is the extent to which academia and political parties have listened to them in a way that they're not listening to us as women. I think the solution is to revisit the women's liberation movement. I really do think that we have spent too long, I don't know what we've been doing, but not very much in the name of feminism. And I think it's timely to bring back, the answer is to bring back feminism, to bring back a politics in which we I seek for myself, I mean, we will all between us have different agendas, and that's okay because we're not chaps. We don't have to actually have one. We don't have to have one view of the world. But I'd like to see us trying to build an 8th demand of the women's liberation movement, which, and it's not for me to say what it is, but I think it would be useful if we actually we took another step, which is called consciousness raising. It was and remains a vital method. And by the way, there aren't many men in the room, but I think that chaps ought to do it as well, but not with women. Right? It's timely for men to do this stuff with each other, and for women to do this thing, this consciousness raising, and to develop a politics which is not about women being better than men. It's about women being and seizing our equality, because most of us are not enabled, encouraged. I'm thinking about us in the world, not just us in Britain. We're not enabled or encouraged to be and to be seen as equal human beings. And these trans people, I mean, some of the women I think are very confused. Actually, they just want to be dykes. And I've had some preliminary conversations with some of them who do recognise that I can wear a suit as well as they can, and I mean a men's suit. I don't mean a women's suit. And I've done this for years and years. I still get served. It's not, but I remain a woman. I don't see what's nice about wearing a bloody dress. I know some women like doing it. I just personally, that's not my thing. But it doesn't signify anything. And lots of these chaps who want to, I don't think they're taking the piss out of women. I just think they're so into themselves, and they want the rest of us to be into them, that we must resist them. And I don't want to resist them by wasting lots of our positive energy. I think we should use our positive energy ourselves, on recreating, however hard it is, to revisit the building of a women's liberation movement that is capable of being universal. It's not seen solely as something that white Europe does or white America does. We need to take back being proud of being women, and I don't have a problem. I've got a son, I've got a grandson, I've got brothers, I've got male friends. I don't have a problem with men per se. I do have a problem with masculinity, as I have a problem about femininity. And these trans people are actually just taking the piss. At least they are if we let them. And I think that our fighting back needs to be not about wasting our energy with them, but actually just asserting who we are and what we want. I don't think I really want to say more than that.
Still on the live.
So how can we fight this Gender Recognition Act?
Can I just, do you want to come on the camera?
Yes,
we haven't spoken about the Gender Recognition Act, and actually you're absolutely right, because tonight is called We Need to Talk About. If it wasn't in a poster, I'd say it in the long form, which is we need to talk about these dangerous conservative proposals to update the Gender Recognition Act. And this consultation is happening in the next few days, weeks, months. It's happening in this parliament, which is a 2-year parliament, and it's supported by it's created by the Conservative Party, and it's supported by the Labour Party, especially the left of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn and Momentum. It's supported by the Liberal Democrats, who one of their councillors in their last year's conference suggested that sex work should be offered to A-level students, school leavers, as a more exciting career than accountancy. This is what this Lib Dem councillor said. The SNP, the Green Party. I personally saw Caroline Lucas at the March of the Mummies, which was about parents' working rights. That was on Halloween this year. And I personally spoke to Caroline Lucas. She was all warm to me, and I said, Caroline, can I speak to you? She was like, yes. And I was like, I need to talk to you about Maria Miller's dangerous proposals to update the Gender Recognition Act. And her whole manner changed. And she just turned away from me and she said, I agree with Maria Miller, and I'm afraid I haven't got time to talk to you. And she walked off. So the Green Party, the SNP, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and the Conservatives, the only against us, and shockingly and shamefully, the only political party in Parliament, and they actually are wielding quite a lot of power at the moment. So maybe we should find allies in. It was the DUP.
Yes. Well, I'm trying to have a meeting with Diane Abbott and another young woman, black woman, who's Shadow something.
Dawn Butler.
Yeah, Dawn.
She's who knows about it.
I'm trying to have a meeting with them because but politically they know that I have some
clout.
Yeah, well, some knowledge of
experience.
I am trying to have a meeting with them. I don't know whether I'll succeed because they want to speak to me separately. I mean, each of them separately, and I'm saying these issues are related.
But can I just say something, Linda? Like, you have clout. You've got all this experience.
Well,
and you brought Black History Month to the UK and stuff. So you have clout, but we all have clout.
Yeah.
We literally all have clout. The only reason I'm involved in this is because I tried to start a Lewisham Momentum meeting. And if the trans activists had just let us have the Momentum meeting, it would have happened. It wouldn't have had all this publicity. It's only the fact that it's such a no-go subject that even a little Lewisham Momentum meeting can then get into the news, and that people can create violence.
So we can all do it.
So I've got 2 more speakers tonight. We've got Janice Williams from Object, and we've also Maria, who is the woman who was assaulted at Speaker's Corner by trans activists who are going to speak. And then we'll have the Q&A. Okay?
And I'm not going to speak for long, so save your questions, start thinking about them. So my name's Janice Williams, I'm the chair of Object. we object to objectification. So we work on a load of issues. We position ourselves fairly mainstream. We like to put things on Facebook from The Sun, The Mail, all those things people love to hate, and all the quality stuff as well. So the issues that we really focus on are obviously porn, prostitution, including lap dancing clubs, strip clubs, surrogacy, where you rent an organ rather than renting an orifice in prostitution, honour-based violence, sexualisation of any kind, and of course the trans erasure of women's rights, spaces, powers and achievements through the current issue with the Gender Recognition Act and so on. We're one of the few women's rights groups to have come out on the trans issue. A lot of them are havering and prevaricating, but I just thought in with a penny, in with a pound. You haven't got a stick, but you might as well do it now, because when everything gets sorted out, we would have been on the right side. Yay! So, we do a lot of critiquing of the English Spectrum of prostitutes, trying to look at the arguments they use and pull them apart. And our latest project is we're offering an essay prize to anyone up to the age of 30, £500 for the best essay on evaluating the environmental impact of prostitution, trying to bring two major issues of our time together and think about the effects of one or the other. So please have a look on our website and encourage all the young women you know to write a wonderful essay. And Sheila, I'm going to be asking you to judge it. So you think you know? Yeah, I hope so too. So moving on to trans erasure. First of all, I'm absolutely overcome to be here with these two giants. Yeah. I'm more of a person that has chats in my local pub. I'm not being important. But I do have a lot of chats. I always raise the trans issue with everybody. And I think the issue is so awful, so egregious, that it's very hard to know how to talk about it in a normal conversation. You know, you can pour out your heart to your nearest and say, oh my God, this is so awful. But what about those people where you sit and how are you and how are you? The kind of things I do, asking, well, what do you think about this trans thing? I ask a lot of questions. I don't know the answers. I say, I sure don't know the answers, but I've got a lot of questions. How come every time you have a discussion, you're called a TERF? My dear daughter called me a TERF. And I said, that's okay, darling. Should we talk about it? Oh, no, she didn't want to talk about it. That's okay. You know, name calling is often a cover for avoiding an issue. That's fine. I'm ready to talk about it whenever you are. So we're waiting. I find it quite helpful to mention all the wonderful people who have come out on this very early. Obviously, two of them are here. Dame Jenny Murray, any Radio 4 listener will Dame Jenny Murray. Private Eye seems to be quite sceptical. Private Eye's got its weaknesses, but there we go. Who is that now? Is it Ray Winston or Robert Winston, the scientist? I get the Robert. Yeah, he wrote an article in the Times. Frankie Boyle, there you go. So I think it's helpful to lob those names into the conversation, depending on who you're talking to. I say, is all this transing on the NHS? Where are the priorities? What about all these people that are having their operations postponed? And, you know, where are how are the priorities allocated? Why is it more important for someone to choose to trans than for someone to have, you know, good medical coverage when they're having a baby? What about, why is there no debate? We're supposed to be a free country. We can talk about Brexit, we can talk about religion, politics. I've sat down at dinner with people I don't know who've said, which way did you vote in the referendum? And yet we can't have a conversation about this issue. Why are we no flat platform? No platforming is for people that are proven deniers, like that awful man that the Denial film was made about. He was proven, his history was false, his facts were wrong. Because we're women. I know that. But I'm talking about how to change people's minds without going away anywhere complicated, you know, just going in the cafe and the pub, like we all normally do anyway. Why are meetings harassed? We don't tell you about that, you know about that, you've known about that tonight. Yeah. Why aren't our universities doing proper research? Why did that guy get stopped from doing a PhD at Harvard University? Yeah, sure it is. Yeah,
it is.
Because they're businesses now.
No, because they're businesses now, because of austerity, because of Tory austerity.
Well, let's face it, our universities are there to give us information on important topics and to
used to be.
Well, that's still a
now
question.
They've got clients.
Throw it out. We don't want the answers, Dennis. We want the people we're talking about to think about the answers. How can under 18s, we've just had this big thing about child sexual abuse and grooming, and it's now everybody knows, I hope, that under 18s cannot consent to sex with an adult. How can under 18s consent to hormone treatment for something that will affect them for their whole lives and render them infertile? It's barking. You don't say that, you let the other people in the conversation say that. And why can't we all just abolish gender and wear what we like, do what we do? Why are all these people that we see who have transed into women? First of all, I don't think you can trans into anything else. You can't make a surplus out of a sow's ear. Why are they so well, Sheila's told us the answer, but we're saying we don't know the answer here. Why are they so stereotypical feminine? I've sat down with friends and I've said, they're all wearing dresses. I've known you for 15 years, I've never seen you in a dress. Yeah. I know you're a woman, you know. It's barking. It's absolutely barking. Isn't transing a choice rather than a disability? To me, it's a choice that's being treated as if it's a disability. People don't choose to be born with a disability. They don't choose to be born a certain race. They don't choose to be born a man or a woman. They've got no choice about it. And if it causes them a problem, they've got to get on with it as best they can. But if you can trans back, and we know people who have, it has to be a choice. And a choice should not be treated with the same amount of respect, dignity and resources as a disability of any kind, or something which society makes a disability, like race or your biological sex. So we need a debate. We need a debate. I throw all these are all questions that I throw around in my local pub, my local cafe, the local mothers' meetings, whatever it is, and it gets people thinking, and people come back. So the other thing we all have to do, and even I've done this, I know this is something we're always told to do, and this time I've actually done it, so I can sit here and say, you must write to your MP. Write to your MP. Definitely write to your MP. The erasure of women's spaces. Why should we've got all this money supposedly encouraging girls and women to go into sport. Why on earth should they bother to try and do well when some bloke who has got the remains, the musculature, the strength, the height, and everything from when he was a man, he still is a man, zooms into women's sport, picks up a heavyweight and makes them all look stupid? Why should anyone bother? It's pathetic. Some of these gentlemen's clubs have said that they're not going to admit trans men. I must admit, I've almost been tempted to put on a suit. And a few of us have talked about, hopping into some male changing rooms. Let's face it, would be a bit of fun. It would be a little bit of a fight back, wouldn't it? A little bit of activism.
I can pass, but frankly, I don't want to do it.
I think the more it's not that pass.
In the men's toilet?
Yes. No.
Quite. So I would say to you, try and have these conversations with everybody. Otherwise, it's going to slip through under the radar. Be the person that people feel safe to talk to about it. I'm sure you won't be called bigots and idiot because you're not. The people you know you're not. Name calling is just a cover for avoiding the issue. None of us here is a TERF, but let's face it, we need questions and we need discussion.
And then our last speaker tonight, we're going to have the last speaker tonight, which is Maria. And we're going to have a little break, so everyone goes to the toilet. Question and answer, where I think that everybody can then say a question or a comment. It doesn't have to be a question, or it can be a question. Any of the panel where you speak for like a maximum of a minute or 2 minutes or something. Maria.
Well, it's a great privilege to be here, and I'm very, very flattered to be asked to speak after a series of such accomplished and brilliant women. And all I did was get duffed up at Speaker's Corner. Duffed up. But it seems people are interested, so I'm just going to say a little bit about it. I will be brief. You may have missed my age in the news coverage. But I am 60, however, I am a late developer. I only came to this issue earlier this year. It was only back in March after the reaction to Jenny Murray that I began to get really interested in it. And that when I went 6 months later on the 13th of September to Speaker's Corner, it was the first time I was ever going to go to a meeting or meet anybody that had been involved in campaigning on this issue. And I went there to learn, as I have done tonight, to hear about things, to hear about the possible changes to legislation and the effects they may have on women. I didn't go to make friends with the TERFs, but as it turns out, that was the best thing that happened to me. And none of them fit the definition of TERF in the way I see that word used every single day on social media. You may have seen the TERFs.com, where TERFs are described as wanting to exclude trans people from housing, employment, education, accommodation equality, local, state, national and United Nations protections, and from fully participating in society as equal citizens. I mean, what bloody liars! I have not seen any evidence to support that kind of allegation, and I wouldn't want anything to do with anyone who thought like that. But what I have seen is a hell of a lot of hate and abuse against us, and I say us because I suppose I'm what they might consider to be a born-again TERF. So when I went to Speaker's Corner, I went there as an outsider, and it was just typical of my luck that I was the one to get set upon by this pack of hoodlums. But I didn't take it personally because I know that the first man to attack had stated on social media earlier in the day that he wanted to come to that meeting in order to fuck some TERFs up. And any of us would have done.
And who loved that? On Facebook, Trans Action for Health London, who were consulted in Maria Miller's consultation, a charity who get money from the government.
What?
Loved that
comment,
tweet or comment or whatever it was, which was the person who then went to initiate the violence against you.
And again, at the anarchist book fair against
but that actual thing.
So the excuse for picking on me was that I was just filming their ridiculous and pathetic protest from a distance of some 3 or 4 meters, even though none of them had asked me to stop. Now, I've gone into some detail about what happened at the assault on my blog at skepticat.org. Skepticat.org. It's also got all the video footage on there. It was very frightening for a few seconds, especially when I went down on the ground, but it could have been a lot worse. I wasn't badly hurt. Yeah. I was very shocked. I was very angry. I'm still very angry. But I'm not going to lie, there was a part of me that was absolutely cock-a-hoop at that, because I thought they had done something so utterly stupid.
Especially if it's been filmed.
Yes. Yes, loads of people. And I thought, surely by behaving in such an aggressive and violent manner, it shows that they are not progressive, they are reactionary, authoritarian, entitled, and male. The women who were on that protest did not attack me. In fact, if you look at the video footage, you can see some of them looking quite shocked. One of them tried to intervene, and then she was set upon, and somebody had to try and intervene and protect her. So I thought it's a public relations disaster for them. And I was right, and I was wrong. I was right in the sense that a very broad section of people were appalled and horrified. I had wonderful message from people all over the world. I had some very supportive message from transgender people themselves who condemned the behaviour. And there were some consequences, like you may have seen this post on Reddit, which is both heartbreaking and fantastic. It's very just a sentence or two of it. Said, I'm 19, I was born female, but I've lived as a trans man for 4 years. I'm detransitioning because I'm sick of this community. I'm sick of the kind of activism that's done in its name. I'm sick of people who want to beat up old ladies.
Oh, you're not an old lady.
There's nothing wrong with being an old lady.
Yeah,
but even so, look at her.
Completely unprovoked because she has a different opinion than them. Now, unsurprisingly, she, the author of this piece, has been attacked and accused of lying, but I believe her because that sentiment has been echoed in other messages. Here's one more I'll read. It says, this is somebody I've become quite friendly with. I despair with what is going on supposedly in my name. It's difficult even to raise concerns in trans circles without becoming a pariah. I'm tempted to say that I'm past caring what the trans community think about me, but I'm trying to be a voice of reason in there. I have my own reasons for standing against self-declaration. but one of them is that I respect women and your right to your own spaces. In real life, I never presume, but I have always been invited in with a warm welcome, and for that I'm so grateful to my female friends and colleagues. Now, because of trans activists like this, the ones who are only campaigning for some fundamental human rights that we would all want them to have, I started to call the others trans cultists rather than trans activists in order to make that distinction, because they are very cultish in their behaviour. And it's not just the trans people themselves, of course, it's the allies, and unfortunately, especially the women who we call handmaidens with good reason. They have no arguments. They have only smears, abuse, gaslighting, and now violence. And the intention is just to shut us up, to silence us. That's what it's all about. Well, one thing that I was most surprised about after the Speaker's Corner attack was, far from condemning and wanting to distance themselves from it, hundreds and hundreds of trans cultists applauded it, celebrated it, said that I'd provoked it, and even that I had started it.
Yeah.
They see things in the footage which simply aren't there.
Headlock.
Yes, exactly. I've got this person who is supposedly half my size in a headlock. I've lifted him off the ground. I've thrashed him around like a rag doll. They stopped short of saying I dragged him through the turpentine and serpentine, and impaled him on the Albert Memorial. But if they said it, it would have been believed. And when I see that kind of craziness and the depths to which they will think, it's easy to understand how hard people find to stand up and stick their heads above the parapet. And some people can't. Perhaps they shouldn't, because they have too much to lose. But those of us who can should, because we want to be on the right side of women's history. So finally, I'm just going to finish off by saying that I've been channeling a lot of my anger into building a website which I will launch in a few weeks. It's called Peak Trans, and I hope it will be a useful resource for those other people who are on that journey and beyond. And all I need to do really is to be a bit more careful about my personal safety than I was at Speaker's Corner. And I am, in fact, because last Saturday, when I discovered the possible whereabouts of one of my assailants, the same bloke, the wannabe TERF upper, I made sure I wasn't alone when I...
Name him.
Well, I don't think I can, quite honestly. Anyway, I and someone else went down to the East End of London, and to cut a long story short, we spotted him, we told the police, and he has been arrested.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't really say any more about that, and I'm out of time anyway, because I want to give time to you.
Have a little break now, and I'll wait till 10-minute break. Yeah, no, you don't have to. You can stay here. We're going to turn off the live stream and stuff, and we'll have a 10-minute break, and then do a Q&A. If that's okay with everyone? Yeah. Have some private time. We're going to have a 10-minute break, and then we're going to go back live for the Q&A.